Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Everybody, and welcome to the James Bond Book Club. My name is Bleasdale, John Bleasdale, and I am joined once again by our good friend, Dr. Brian Baker. Good to meet you, Dr. Baker.
Thanks very much, John.
Brian is a professor at the University of Lancaster, and he has published widely on science fiction, and he's also an artist and writer himself. So a man with many quivers to his bow.
Many parts. Don't always fit together well, but many parts.
Today we're going to be talking about For Your Eyes Only, the first anthology of James Bond stories that Ian Fleming published. The title of the anthology comes from one of the short stories, and there are several titles here that have been farmed out for film titles. I don't know about you, Brian, but I spent a lot of time as I was reading this singing Sheena Easton's hit song For Your Eyes Only. Whatever happened to Sheena Easton? I think she went and had a career with Prince.
The time of the Prince and the Revolution. So just, I think, kind of before the Sign of the Times album. I think she might have been actually on that album. But yeah, I don't know. That was always a weird one because I remember her in probably about 1980 being on a kind of not. It wasn't a kind of The Voice or that kind of program. It was a documentary series about people who were trying to do certain things, and she was on it as an aspiring singer. And I think it kind of gave her a bit of a profile. That the fact that kind of there was this half-an-hour BBC Scotland documentary on her, and I think she had a few kind of small hits before For Your Eyes Only came out as a film, which was 1981, wasn't it? So I think in a sense, kind of her profile was at its most popular kind of before she was given the job to do that. So it's a real kind of not coincidence exactly, but kind of lucky for her in that kind of that she suddenly shot into kind of public recognition, just presumably while they were in production for the film.
I think it's kind of a really good song as well. I think there's a reason that it sort of pops into my head whenever I think of the title of the anthology. Also, it was my first James Bond film at the cinema, so that gives it an added poignancy.
Yeah, and it's a film I really like actually. It's one, kind of the back to basics Bond in a way. Whereas I think we might have mentioned last time, kind of where he throws his ZX-81 off the top of the tower at the end. This kind of high-tech gadget into 1,000 plastic pieces at the bottom of the hill.
And Mrs. Thatcher turns up and has a conversation with a rude parakeet.
Oh, God. Yeah. Is it Faith Brown or Janet Brown? Janet Brown.
Janet Brown.
Yeah, Janet Brown. Yeah, because both of them did Thatcher impersonations at that particular time. Yeah. That's right. I definitely saw that at the cinema as well. And it's also, of course, also got the fantastic disco soundtrack, isn't it? So, Would You Go is one of my favourite soundtracks. I can't remember the name of the composer now. Can you remember?
Because George Martin did Live and Let Die, and then was it Bill Conti did one of the? Maybe that was Spy Love Me.
Bill Conti. Yeah, so it wasn't a Barry soundtrack. So it's got some, when on the ski sequences and stuff, there's some classic kind of a bass kind of bass runs and that kind of stuff. It's slightly after its time, of course, with 1981, the high point of disco had long passed. But it's fun. It gives it a particular flavour, I think.
Very little to do with the film. It's sort of with the book, the story from which the title is taken, which is the second story of the anthology, and that's the middle part of the movie, really, rather than this. I mean, it's interesting with these stories because one of the things that I found as I was going through it, this anthology, is some of the stories read very much like synopses for longer adventures, and they feel like they've crammed in a lot. And other stories feel like they're definitely short stories. This is definitely this is exactly as long as it should be. And For Your Eyes Only, it feels like it does feel actually like one of it could be a movie that it could have a longer sort of lifespan, even though the movie goes off in lots of different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, kind of there was. I mean, For Your Eyes Only, Risico, and From a View to a Kill are kind of like mini missions, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're kind of like small versions, and I think some of them were based on pictures he did for a TV series, weren't they?
In 1958, there was an idea that he would do or 57 maybe a bit earlier. There was an idea that he would write some scripts for a TV show, and he wrote out a bunch of synopses. And I think, four of these stories are based on that. I think Quantum of Solace isn't. Risico is. For Your Eyes Only and From a View to a Kill are. So yeah, those three are the ones that are these TV, essentially potential TV stories, which speaks to Fleming's reluctance to ever give up an idea if he developed it, which he would get into a lot of trouble with when it came to Thunderball, because that put him in a lot of legal and cost him his life.
And cost him his life.
Well, he had his first heart attack during the legal case against Kevin McClory, or against him that he was defending. And yeah, I mean, he recovered from that, but of course, with a weakened heart, it was the sort of first danger bell, which then only a few years later, he had his second fatal heart attack on a golf course. So yeah, it might be also related to the 3 packets of cigarettes a day he was smoking and
Well,
2
yeah,
bottles of whiskey.
have something to do with it. Yeah. Yeah, so it probably was just Thunderball. Yeah. It was the Johnny Walker, really. Yeah, yeah. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, when I was kind of reading the kind of for this pod, I also read the other collection, which you might be dealing with later, the kind of the posthumous collection of Octopussy and The Living Daylights, and there seems to be like 2 different kinds of stories in both of them. Really, one is the kind of the mini mission,
Yeah.
where kind of it's a kind of and of course 2 of them, which is Risico and For Your Eyes Only, are kind of put together, aren't they? Mashed together to make For Your Eyes Only the film. But then there's things like the Hildebrand Rarity and Quantum of Solace, and then in the later anthology, Octopussy and 007 in New York, which are I call them pretexts, because they kind of, but Bond's at the margins of them, really. And kind of, or if he's not at the margin, the idea of adventure is pushed to the margin, and a different side of him is kind of presented to us. So they're almost the stories are pretext for some kind of investigation of Bond's emotional landscape or psychology, or response to some other kind of stimuli than the bare facts of a mission. And so those ones are kind of, so here kind of Hildebrand Rarity and Quantum of Solace are kind of, they're not experimental, are they? But they're doing something different with the kind of the character of Bond, and therefore with the formula process of what the story is.
I totally agree, and I think that also reflects on the novels, because when you've read these, you see that in the novels he is increasingly more interested in the women and in putting Bond in really different contexts. The most extreme of this will be The Spy Who Loved Me, which we're going to come on to, in another episode, but where the whole of the novel is narrated by a woman, and Bond turns up, halfway through, about, page 70 of a 120-page novel. And even to some degree, I would argue one of the best later novels, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, is almost entirely shot through with, yes, there's a mission, yes, there's a job to do, yes, he has to find Blofeld, but it's really about Bond adjusting to the idea of maybe getting married, and actually, being very into the idea of getting married. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it's as much a book about Tracy as it is about Bond, but I feel that the book that Fleming is kind of drags himself back to Bond when he's more interested in Tracy.
And the question I was going to ask you, John, actually was: do you feel as though the short story has a determining effect on what kind of Bond is presented to us? That the kind of the novel length Bond is able to, obviously, as we saw in even from Russia with Love, he doesn't even appear until the second half of the novel. but the apparatus of the machinery of whatever boss or kind of spy kind of adventure is going on enables him to respond in certain ways, sometimes fairly kind of conventional ways, in a way that a superhero, kind of a secret agent would respond to these things. Whereas I wonder whether the short story itself determines a different kind of Bond that you don't really have, because you have this weird thing, don't you? Kind of so at the end of something like Pure, From a View to a Kill, where the kind of the girl thing is almost tacked on at the end, and the same is true actually of Pure Eyes Only, where you kind of that part of the Bond, kind of his relationship to women. It's almost just kind of waved at the end as a kind of, oh, this, you have to have this in a Bond story, and we'll deal with that in the last two sentences type thing. Do you feel as though the story form itself has a kind of determining effect on the way that we think, or the way that Bond is presented?
I think it does, in the sense that it frees Fleming up to experiment, but at the same time, it does make those issues of what he feels the reader is expecting to look a little bit too mechanical and a little bit too, as you say, tacked on. It also allows him to explore some of his influences a little bit more deeply, and I'm sure we can get into this a little bit more when we come to Quantum of Solace, which is very obviously a tribute to W. Somerset Maugham and the sort of or even Conrad, I was told this story and here it is, and it's a story told to, between two men smoking cigars. So I think he likes going in those different directions, and the short story gives him that possibility of going into different lives. But I also think what's interesting there is then again, how does that reflect on the continuity of Bond as a character? And one of the things that I've noticed with reading all of these stories chronologically is just how continuous this series is. They really are different chapters in the same book, and they're very. I mean, if you thought about this as a great modernist experimental novel, as in the whole oeuvre of Fleming, the whole of James Bond, then each chapter might have great experiments in a variation on a theme, but they're kind of telling the same story over and over again, but trying to develop it and move it along in different ways. And each book seems to learn from the last, or try something else, or respond to a criticism. And those things accelerate when you come to the short story, because you can tell you can tell there's an element of him not wanting to commit himself to a novel anymore.
So that's really interesting. You said that, the kind of the idea of a kind of roman fleuve, the whole thing. I'm a big fan of the Patrick O'Brian, Aubrey Maturin books.
Absolutely, read them all.
Yeah. I read them through a couple of times. They're kind of. It's interesting that Bond isn't thought of in that kind of way, because when I was again doing a bit of prep around the publication of the short stories and the chronologies, which are kind of implied in the novels, there's a couple of them, aren't there, which are kind of slightly different, but they're quite tight, aren't they? They're kind of there's not much distinction. So it's really interesting that kind of what you're saying there about the idea that one novel follows on quite closely on another, and you can kind of very easily kind of there's very little sense that there's a when is this taking place? Is it kind of 2 years ago or 2 years before? There's a kind of very strong locked sense of when these things take place. I mean, do you think these then are the kind of the short stories, because they do slot into a chronology, don't they? But are they then kind of almost holidays from the chronology as well? Are they kind of oases where he can just allow Bond to do something slightly different outside of the overall story that he's going to be telling?
Well, you often find that Bond, and it happens in this case as well, is sort of on his way somewhere else to do something else when this happens, or on his way in Goldfinger, famously, he's on his way back from a mission when another mission is starts to take place when he meets Goldfinger. And with the novels, in terms of that tightness, yes, there is a definite chronology, and many people have sort of printed it out and written it up and worked out this happens in 56, this is 57, and these short stories literally Yeah, these short stories, I have a chronology. I think I've got a chronology here that I just give you a very brief. Okay, right. So, 57 to 58, five short missions as described in For Your Eyes Only. October 57, pursues a narcotics ring in Rome, which leads him to Venice, Risico. April 1958, sent to the Seychelles to observe the communist threat to the British fleet, takes a trip to a remote atoll in search of a rare fish. May 1958, on his way back from a failed mission in Austria, Bond assists Station F in uncovering a nest of Soviet assassins from A View to a Kill. October 58, a personal favor to M, Bond goes to Vermont to kill a gang of hoods For Your Eyes Only. Winter 58, short mission to Nassau to sabotage Castro's gun smuggling operation. Is told a long anecdote by the governor, Quantum of Solace. And then, 1959 is when Thunderball happens, but also when The Living Daylights happen. So,
Right.
And you will often have him in the novels saying something like, "Oh, that was when that Moonraker business happened. You might have heard about it last spring." And
Yeah.
he'll very specifically refer to things. You might have heard of, the Thunderball operation. Well, this is the same guy. There's, I mean, I don't want to skip ahead too much, but I've just finished on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and they're dealing with Blofeld after Thunderball has happened. And showing one of the themes that runs through the books is the incredible naivety of the British Secret Service. Blofeld, they discover Blofeld's plan of sort of hypnotizing these girls, and they honestly can't think of how this is a bad thing. And basically M saying, well, maybe he's turned over a new leaf. And suddenly someone slaps their forehead and says, wait a minute, logical warfare. And the head of the Secret Service has to have biological warfare explained to him. What on earth's that? You can't make warfare with biology. It's a school subject.
Oh dear, oh dear. Yeah. No,
So
it's interesting, isn't it? You're right about that idea of failure as well, isn't it? That kind of that is such an interesting thing in all of these short stories, actually. That there's he's on his way back from somewhere, or he's hacked off because kind of bored out of his mind, or in Hildebrand Rarity, the mission is finished early because there's nothing to do there, and he's just kicking his heels. Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? That there's it's not exactly Bond at bay, is it? But there's a kind of sense of often there's a sense of frustration in these short stories, isn't there? That he's the whatever adventures and terrors but pleasures come with the kind of the being who he is they've kind of run out in lots of these, really. There's not the access in the same way to either the conoscenti kind of pleasures of consumption that you find in some of them, or the kind of the kind of either the thrill seeking or the kind of the kind of the tactile adventure of the main stories, the main chronologies. He's like a playboy. He's a bit of an old roue in some of them, and he's jaded.
Yeah, he's like an old Byronic figure, really. That he's
Yeah,
flipping between wanting to travel and finding out that wherever he goes, he's still there, and that's sort of the ultimate terror of the traveler is you're trying to essentially renew yourself in some way. And he's not a tourist because he's on a mission, but the missions either, well, in the very first one, View to a Kill, fail, or in the Quantum of Solace, I think, when he's going to Castro, he actually is politically in agreement with the rebels. He thinks that
yes, that was a really surprising detail. That it's mentioned a couple of times in this collection. Kind of Castro is mentioned with either neutrally or even positively, and it was like, oh wow, that's and obviously kind of what happens at the beginning of For Your Eyes Only with these kind of Batista hoods, kind of turning up and getting rid of the colonists. I mean, that's we can go into that. That's such an interesting kind of scenario that I'll kind of entirely. But that's a kind of it's meant to be boredom, I think, isn't it? The kind of it's the kind of it's the underlying strata of the espionage novel is boredom. That kind of because the kind of lots of the kind of the operative just sit around doing nothing for a hell of a long time. Either they're listening to people, and nothing. I mean, Le Carre makes an absolute, kind of focal point of boredom, doesn't he? Because kind of the story takes so long to unwind, and there's no thrill or adventure like this. It's just kind of the grinding of the machinery in a sense. So I think that's where this kind of intersects with that different kind of espionage story, isn't it? That kind of here he's fighting off the what's ever present for him, which is boredom and ennui, really. That's the kind of the state of the secret agent.
I think Le Carre has this thing that his books are largely structured around very long periods where people are just telling each other stuff and recounting stories. And so, when did you meet him? Oh, I was in such and such a place at such and such a time. And you have these, his books seem to be a debriefing from the ante room of hell. Whereas, so he's a writer of the word, and Fleming is, as you point out, a writer of sensation and adventure. And the problem with that is, how are you going to increasingly have that, or without sort of diminishing returns? And there are, I mean, this comes after Dr. No, right? I think. Yes, I think it does. No, it comes after Goldfinger, sorry. And Dr. No, yeah. And Dr. No has been widely criticized as his sort of way too extravagant, way too sort of elaborate. And Goldfinger has this huge story, which is, about Fort Knox, and it's just sort of increase. So the idea is Bond is becoming increasingly implausible. The stories are becoming higher stakes than they were. We talked about From Russia with Love, and the stakes we talked about there during our conversation are really low. They're really like, let's get this Enigma type of machine, and that's it, and we're good, and job well done. So I think the short stories are maybe also, in a way, a kind of reaction to that criticism. Okay, let's see the Bond in a few smaller situations on his way home from a mission rather than on a mission, and have him focus on something. Let's go through them individually and see
Sure.
what. So the collection starts with From a View to a Kill. The eyes behind the
Yes.
wide black rubber goggles were as cold as flint, is the first line of this story, just to get you in the mood. The initial idea for the opening scene of a man on a motorbike chasing another man on a motorbike and killing him was apparently supposed to be used in Moonraker as part of Hugo Drax's backstory, because he was a motorcycle messenger during the Second World War. So that had been the original sort of development of this idea, and it hadn't fit in. It didn't fit in, or he didn't use it, and so he's resurrected it to use for this thing, and it works as a really exciting set piece. Fleming's. I remember seeing a Harry Hill once and him saying there aren't many car chases in novels, and I would beg to differ. Fleming does car chases, and he does them kind of well.
I mean, when I started reading that, thinking, when is this being set? Because you've got motorcycle dispatch riders. I was wondering whether it was a kind of a flashback to a Second World War scene where something was going to then emerge in the Bond's present or whatever. And so it was a curious opening in a way, because it's almost a sleight of hand, because it's in France, but it's kind of NATO dispatch riders and some kind of enemy that you don't even quite identified. But he has this kind of, when the assassin kind of kills the dispatch rider, he turns around and speeds off, and he's got this turnip grin on his face as the wing is kind of pushing his mother. And I thought, oh yeah, he's Russian. So kind of that places you immediately. These are kind of in that Red Grant type thing, but there's I think it's an interesting opening, isn't it? Because but obviously Bond's not in it. It is temporarily kind of a bit indistinct. It's an interesting in media res, kind of it's cinematic, I suppose, in a way, isn't it? It kind of, you think, as you say, it's a good, kind of opening with the pre-credit sequence almost. But for the story, it's a bit of an. It's obviously it's the murder which he investigates, but it's a bit of an odd. For me, it was just a little bit strange as a kind of an opening gambit for this collection.
Absolutely. And also the other problem Bond has, and I think this is one of the problems that he has throughout the novels as well as the short stories, is that Fleming never really quite works out what his special talent is. You know, it isn't really detection. And he describes himself as a kind of policeman, which is his sort of like go-to explanation to people, you know. And we referred to him earlier as a spy, and yet he seems incredibly ill-equipped for that sort of job because he's not anonymous. He's kind of very very loud in very memorable in some ways. And so so in this short story, one of the interesting things is this is actually Fleming actually makes him do some detection and makes him actually sort of walk around and look at things and try to work out how things were done. And that's kind of unusual. I mean, aside from plucking hairs from his head and, you know, putting them across doors, he hasn't got that many tricks up his sleeve, which, by the way, he does in about 5 or 6 different novels.
It's funny in one of the later stories, I think it's Portrait of a Lady, he comes up with a plan to use an auction to reveal who the top Soviet agent is in London, and he's almost childishly excited by the fact that he's actually come up with some kind of idea. It's like, oh, everyone's going to love this, you know. I hope it works out all right. So you're right, and since that idea of him that he's an instrument, isn't he, and quite a blunt one a lot of the time. And he's not a smiley who can kind of psychologically tune into the enemy, or he's not a field operative who's able to, you know, more like a detective, I suppose. There's something, I don't know, it's something about his presence itself, isn't it? Which is is a catalyzer of story in a way. And so, so in a sense, you know, he goes and lies on branches in 2 of the stories in this collection, and you know, and kind of just waits. But his presence itself is a kind of catalyzer for, you know, kind of literally things open up to him in that moment. There's so much about it's interesting, isn't it, in terms of the title for this particular collection, For Your Eyes Only. There's so much about watching, isn't there, in this whole collection. You know, he does a lot of it, doesn't he? I mean, I thought about From Russia with Love with the periscope as well. There's this kind of sense of Bond the Watcher here, but that's his prime attribute in the story. His capacity to be still and watch for long enough for things to reveal themselves to him.
Yeah, and I like the idea of catalyst, and I mean it gives that's the reason he sort of bumps into people so often in the books, is that he's kind of like, you get a feeling if he stands still, the story will come to him. You know, people will,
yeah.
You know, and it's that old cliche of the Bond books, which is entirely based on truth, is that villains just want to tell him stories, want to tell him, you know, their entire plans as soon as the minute they meet him. It's like he doesn't have to interrogate them or, oh damn you, Mr. Bond, you forced me to reveal everything. It's like, okay, we'll hire you to be a secretary and I'll tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he's remarkably lucky when it comes to this sort of stuff. And even here, sort of, I mean, if you think about his plan and the general idea, you know, the death of a dispatch writer, surely you would just think, right, we'll change our routes, change everything up, plug the leaks, you know. It's like, no, don't do that. We'll send another one and I'll be and I'll, you know, it's basically, we'll use a decoy and we'll, you know, turn the trap on the enemy. But that doesn't even make much sense, because surely the enemy would just assume that counterintelligence measures were going to be taken immediately and not repeat.
After a murder, you'd think.
You'd think they'd be like packing up and on the first plane back to Russia, you know, or the train to Berlin or something. It's not like, no, we'll hang around.
How stupid are these British?
Yeah, we'll get another one.
That's right. Yeah. We've got one salmon here. We might as well put the line in again and see if we can reel another one in. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, it's true, isn't it? You know, kind of, and yeah, he's bait, isn't he? In that kind of very formulaic kind of narrative, I suppose. Really, where he puts himself out. But again, well, you know, once he shoots the other guy, I mean, what's the point of that? Was he going to follow? I mean, the only way you can do it really is to follow him back to where the lair is. He doesn't need to kind of offer himself as bait to follow them back to where the the underground areas.
I mean, he knows
It's
where
yeah,
they are. They can
all of
just throw some
yeah.
grenades.
But I think I mean I was kind of with that thing with I suppose it kind of for me it made me kind of think about James Bond's World War II career.
Mm.
So obviously he must have served in the military, you know, kind of. Is he meant to enter Secret Service in the early 50s
Uh,
or late 40s?
I think he's meant to have continued it. I mean, if you were thinking that he's somehow shadowed Fleming's own career, then he's in the Navy and in naval intelligence during the war.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
with Casino Royale, he's already got his 007
yeah,
license, and
and that's
he's got that via shooting two people, killing two people, a Norwegian,
mm,
so Quisling, as you know, the word
mm,
comes for out of Second World War, and a Japanese staff member of the embassy who he shoots through a skyscraper in New York through the window. Someone shoots a hole in the window, and he shoots after through the hole, which is like, wow, that's sort of a remarkable shot for someone who later in the books is sort of considered an okay shot, but not like superhuman in terms of his marksmanship.
yeah. In fact, kind of in Risico, he misses, doesn't he?
Yeah.
From the close range. So yeah, kind of that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
What?
when obviously the space thing, you know, kind of when he gets there, it's so this kind of mound, you know, we covered in covered in bushes, which then splits open, and uh, and these kind of geezers come out. How on earth did they kind of put that there? Some kind of without anyone noticing. There's some kind of, you know, it's not just some kind of wartime bunker or something. There's some elaborate machinery that kind of works there, you know, kind of. And I found it very interesting that Bond actually never goes down into the bunker. There's this kind of there's a very interesting sleight of hand to do with, you know, kind of what this thing is, you know, kind of how extensive is it, you
You've
know,
got
kind of, you know, what does it
kitchens.
consist of? Yeah, yeah, bunk beds. You know, what kind of operations go on there? That's completely shunted off to the side of the story. It's kind of not. It's not of interest to the story in a way. Perhaps because I suppose it's that indicates a story which the kind of, a narrative that the short story form can't consider. It's just it's too big, and so Bond has to literally stay on the surface. He can't go deeper into the mechanism of the story in a way. It has to complete it there.
I think it also goes back to what you were saying about the Second World War. I think it makes much more sense as a sort of left behind group of sort of werewolves who have sort of dug in literally,
That's
and
interesting.
and they, the front line has gone past, and they can now get up and pick off people at will. But yeah,
Wow.
in the middle of France in the 1950s, it doesn't make as much sense. By the way, I've looked up on my James Bond timeline, which has been published in James Bond: The Man and His World by Henry Chancellor. It says 41 to 44 assassinates a Japanese codebreaker in the Rockefeller Center, New York. Knives a Norwegian double agent in Stockholm. Awarded his double O license to kill status. Travels around the world, American Jamaica mentioned. 1944 sees action in the Ardennes forest.
Wow.
1945 in Hong Kong ends war as Commander RNVR. Decides to stay in the double O section, retaining his license to kill, and that's him from 45 to 51 going on missions until 51 is when Casino Royale is set and
Casino
his
Royale.
career begins, in full.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right about this kind of idea of the left behind one, the kind of that because it just shows how in in a sense how indebted that story is to World War II. Really, you
Mm.
know, kind of it's set on, you know, kind of in some kind of space outside of Paris, but it's kind of it's very nondescript Europe essentially. It's kind of out of time. There's no markers of it being at the time of the, you know, the kind of the, you know, coterminous with the rise of the new wave. Kind of Godard and Truffaut are making movies at the same time as this. You know, there's no real sense of that. So kind of yeah, so that, I think that's really interesting. That kind of that there's this kind of almost temporal displacement to the story. It's a much older kind of story than one that you might expect from the late 50s in a way.
There's no traffic on the roads.
Yes,
You know, I
yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
in the 1950s, a road in France is you're not going to get many, stretches of road where there's absolutely no traffic for, protracted amounts of time.
Not in the near environs of Paris, anyway. Certainly
No,
not.
no. Following on from what you said earlier about the Marianne Russell, the sort of
Yes.
love interest. I mean, you also, aside from the love interest, very passing sort of like just having a date and dinner or something. There's also this thing that comes up quite frequently in the Bond books of him having a rather bristly relationship with his immediate, the people he's supposed to be liaising with.
Mm.
You know,
I mean, I found her a really interesting figure actually, because she's unlike. I mean, she's very capable. She saved his life at the end by running up and she shoot him. The guy who's traveling with. I can't remember now, or does she bash him? But she's very self-contained, very as a capable, knowing, and a kind of equal really. She's not just someone who is kind of a helpmate or someone who kind of carries his bags or whatever. There's a kind of autonomy about her, which I found really interesting. She's the kind of the most interesting thing about the story, really. And I
mm.
thought, oh, it'd be quite nice if there was more of her, really, in this or somewhere else. You can imagine her, being a kind of a continued character somehow, not exactly a Felix fighter, but as someone who would turn up in other stories.
Yeah, that is interesting, and that it goes with the next story, which we'll get onto in a moment. But For Your Eyes Only as well has a very strong female character, the daughter, uh, uh,
Yes,
Havelock. Sorry, Judy Havelock. There's a similar sort of pattern to the two, where in both cases you have women who are very much their own autonomous agents. They're different characters and by no means a copy of each other. But in the end of the story, you have a sort of suggestion that they're taking their lead now from James Bond, not necessarily submissively or anything like that, but at the end of For Your Eyes Only, it's sort of like, is that an order? Is the sort of
yes.
one of the last lines, and he says yes, and that's it's but you have these master submission relationships all the way through where which are interestingly reversed. In Doctor No, Honeychild Rider says, "Now I want my slave time," meaning he's got to be her slave now, and
Right.
he's the
Yeah,
one
yeah.
who has to submit to her. And I mean, I think Fleming liked a little bit of his S&M, his little bit of dominatrix. So he liked to dish it out, but he liked to get it as well. So.
Yeah, and I think that scene, if your eyes only, where she kind of basically points the bow and arrow at his leg, and and says, basically he doesn't have a choice,
Mm.
because 'cause he can't fire his gun because of it. That would alert the villain to what's going on. But she can basically kind of incapacitate him, at that range particularly, and just put that arrow through his leg. That was a really interesting standoff because
Mm.
he doesn't come out on top there.
Mm.
Kind of he can't force his will on her, and since he has to accede to her in a way, and the way that she goes off and fires the arrow, kind of to kill what's his name, the Germanic name,
Hammerstein.
in yeah, there's some right names in these short stories, aren't there? Yeah,
Von
yeah,
Hammerstein.
Von Hammerstein, yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, there was an absolute beauty. I can't remember which one it was in. That's in actually Property of Lego. Maria Freudenstein. In fact, it is. Even though talked about the Freudenstein. Come on. But yeah, but the kind of I think it's. I'm not sure whether there's an awareness by Fleming in these stories of how Bond was received as a kind of misogynistic figure, but there does seem to be a kind of shifting the ground, where he's not exactly meeting his match. And you do have these, as you say, these gestures towards the end where both of them are kind of, meet me in the hotel or go for lunch or whatever. But it's not seduction. there's a kind of antagonism, or even kind of parity of power are kind of at work here, which I think is really. Do you think it is a kind of deliberate strategy on Fleming's part to try to shift the ground a little bit with the way the Bond reacts to, and relates to women?
That's interesting. I mean, he's definitely reacting to the public. There's no doubt about it that he wants to be liked, and he wants to be. I mean, he was a journalist, so he was a professional writer who wrote for a public, and didn't have any bones about it. And the endless amounts of products that he would put into his books was part of a product placement that he was hoping to get get some offers, I think, from some of it. Although I read a really interesting story recently about Live and Let Die, which is the second novel, and when he was still very much listening to proofreaders, and he ate bacon and eggs so often in that book that one of the early proofreaders or copy editors sent back that any enemy of Bond would simply have to go around all the restaurants saying, "Has a man been in here eating bacon and eggs?" And they'd be able to trace him. They'd be able to trace him with absolute ease. So he had to go back to the book and sort of take out the bacon and eggs and add some, sole or something as alternative breakfasts whenever he's eating in public. So I think there is that reactivity, that Fleming has, that he's definitely aware of his readerships. Now, he seems to have so much fun when it comes to sexual relationships, and so much he's almost embarrassingly naked, I think, Fleming, when it comes to his sexual desire. I'm struggling to think of a word, but fantasies, desire, the whole thing about, like a small boy's bottom, and the tang of rape. And I mean, it goes throughout that there is always this very weird sexual fantasy that's going on, which is in some ways very dark and misogynistic, and in other ways wants to give women a power over men, and also a really puppyish romanticism where Bond just collapses at the feet of some women and just immediately says, "I love you," when within 5 minutes of meeting someone, and I don't think it's a line, I don't think I think he genuinely falls in love with many of the women that, he then either can or can't get. And usually in the next book, there has to be a paragraph about why they couldn't get on or what happened, and it's often the woman leaving. It's not, it's not because it's not it's not him leaving them, it's them leaving him usually.
No, I think I think that's absolutely right in the sense of what you said before about Honey Child Rider, and that's clearly, kind of the power reversal there to do with the slave is clearly eroticized. But I'm not sure whether it quite is in the same way here, because I said the gestures towards the romantic at the end or the sexual are so offhand, in a sense. They're so rote that it doesn't seem to kind of put the two women back in the box in a way. There's something about the presence of both of those women in the stories which exceeds their role either as romantic object, or as damsel in distress, or even as kind of subordinate colleague. It's almost as though they've kind of, particularly I think with Marianne Russell, in a sense, it's almost as though Fleming's imagination of her has exceeded her role in the story somehow, and she's more vibrant than she perhaps needs to be in that particular story. And the way and even the way that kind of Judy kind of is imagined, again, it disrupts. She has an autonomy which is really disruptive for the story itself. It doesn't really, it can't come to its proper conclusion because she asserts herself in a way which disrupts everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a version of the story where Bond doesn't turn up, and she kills the guy with the crossbow and melts away into the woods and is never seen again. And succeed. If anything, he's kind of in the way. If he,
Yeah, no, he is.
if he didn't turn up, the net result would have been the same, but maybe the henchman would have survived. But other than that, his presence is kind of surplus.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? Yeah, again, I suppose it's kind of this one is perhaps a mixture of the kind of the mission story and the because it's not really a mission story either, is it? Because it's a revenge story.
Mm.
It's something extraneous. It's not to do with kind of British interests or anything like that. It's wanting him to go out and sort some people out who have killed someone. So there's I think there's a really interesting thing there where the kind of story that it is that in a sense it's revealing something about the limits, perhaps, of Bond's reach. That there's only, and you say, and in some ways, that kind of death at the end would have been achieved without him. He's not really needed.
It would have been a personal act of murder, and
Yeah,
as
yeah,
such, it's much more appropriate for her to do it than it is for him to do it. Because, I
yeah.
mean, we've seen M ask Bond for a favor in the past. Moonraker was entirely premised on the beginning of a favor I've got this guy cheating at my local club. Could you come and give him a look see? But it wasn't like, can you come and kill him for me?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like yeah. I mean,
Do me a favor, James.
M's really. There's this guy who keeps parking on the verge in my street. Can you come and off him for me?
Exactly.
I'm going to use your.
Yeah, yeah. You get caught, you're on your own, but
Yeah, don't put anything on paper, and I'm going to deny I asked you. And it sort of speaks largely to Bond's own relationship to M, that he'll basically do anything for him. He's so
yes.
in love with him as a father figure. He does give it a sort of political gloss, which is interesting in the sense that he sort of says, well, if these guys can get away with this, then we'll be our sort of position in the world. They'll think they can do anything to us, and it's a very post-imperial. We're gonna, you can't touch British people. They should be treated with impunity rather than. And that scene of the murder of the Havelocks, I found a really interesting. There's a really interesting nastiness to it. It's a really sort of good Hemingway-esque sort of the killers moment, where the level of danger increases, by the moment.
Yeah, no, it's very well handled that thing, isn't it? I think you're absolutely right. Where it ratchets up, and there's the insistence, the repetition of the offer, which isn't really an offer. Yeah, and also their blitheness, really, at the beginning, because they feel themselves to be untouchable as well. They don't think that these gangsters can come in and shoot them in their own homes. They was just go away, fellow, you ruffian. There's I suppose there's a really interesting interrogation of British colonial power, isn't there, here, and the legacy of British colonialism in Jamaica. That I mean, as you said, the British are untouchable, but it's a kind of anxiety about displacement, isn't it, from a settler class? That kind of if you think kind of I thought about kind of courtesy and disgrace,
Right.
in the South African thing, which is about the kind of white South African farmers being kind of their farms being taken from them and violently. And I thought, and it's kind of colonial violence, which is underpins the entirety of the plantation economy. It kind of comes back to haunt them. It comes back to revisit them in another form. It's a curiously kind of gothic quality to it, almost. The buried secrets of colonialism, the buried violence, finally come back and destroy the Havelocks. And M's revenge is an attempt to try to put a lid on that. But no, but obviously we know the tide of that history is running well against him.
And I think that links a little bit to what you were saying about the Judy, Judy's action at the end. You know, you have Bond go out and he's doing this, so that it's a little bit of a procedural. How do you go about killing these guys? And you're on a mission and all the rest of it. And he dyes himself with tea colored. Um,
Yeah, what's that
I don't know. So
about?
like,
Walnut.
you don't want to look too pallid when you're in Canada, apparently. Um, and he
Perhaps he's going to hide. He's going to kind of pretend he's a Welsh dresser or something. Or,
Teak.
or do some yoga in the garden and pretend he's kind of an armchair.
Oh, it's so funny. Um, and he does all that. He sets himself up, but really, there's a sense that Judy, when she turns up, she's like also a younger generation to Bond. And you
Yes.
really, she's a daughter, and Bond is looking upon M as the father, but you know, M's an old guy. These are old people. Bond is entering middle age, if not fully middle age by now. You know, he's been active now for 20 years in the Secret Service, and he's so when Judy walks away, there's actually this line I wanted to quote. Um, she fell in behind and followed him. And so she walked, and as she walked, she pulled the tired bits of golden rod out of her hair and undid a ribbon and let the pale gold hair fall down to her shoulders. And so it's almost like she's okay, now I can be a young girl again. Now I can be a young woman again. Sort of done my job and I can return to youth to some degree. And it's like she's done a job and she's got over this, but he's, you know, this is his world, this is where he lives, you know,
Mm,
this is what
mm.
he's doing for the rest of his life. um and yeah, do we get a feeling that, you know, they're going back and there's going to be anything romantic, or does it feel like an inappropriate relationship because of an age
Yeah,
difference?
yeah. I mean, I think the generational thing is really interesting, isn't it? Because them and the Havelocks clearly are a pre-war generation, and then Bond is the wartime generation, and she's very much kind of presented as the kind of the new woman of the late 50s. You know, you can see the kind of the foreshadowing of the 60s coming in
And
someone
it's
like
published
Havelock
in
and also in
1960.
Marianne
published
Russell,
published in
published in
1960.
1960. There we go. So I think kind of that's right. There is this kind of Bond finds himself kind of interstitial in a way, doesn't he? He
Mm.
kind of rather than being the kind of the golden generation, the prime generation, the wartime one, he's kind of caught in this mission between the legacies of the previous generation, her grandfathers essentially, even though they're posited as the kind of daughter, because she's in a sense far too young in a way to be their daughter. You know, kind of there's some kind of odd playing around with time there. But it kind of sets him a bit, doesn't it? I think really the wartime generation is kind of displaced from this particular narrative, because it's the pre-war colonial generation and then the generation the younger ones. And Bond's just kind of like he's as we said before, he's not really necessary. That you know, kind of and since perhaps some of the illusions and the ideologies of that immediate post-war periods, you know, they start to become a bit redundant. You know, or some of the legacies of colonial empire and the idea of Britain being some kind of player in the global game are starting to fray a lot, really. And Bond is just sent off to murder people.
Right. And you know, I mean, there's so much in Bond throughout the novels as well, which is about him questioning what he does and why he does it. And he's much more reflective as a character than any of the film versions of him ever are. Maybe Daniel Craig is the only one who really gets there. Timothy Dalton, to some degree, sort of heads in that direction as well. Um, but there's but this one is one where you sort of feel he's going out to do it really on a whim, rather than on any sense of it's completely inappropriate. I mean, there's nothing that divides him from the other people, and that's something that he knows. Let's go on to Quantum of Solace as well, because this I think is
Mm,
this is the real anomaly in the collection. It's the one that
mm.
is Bond hearing a story. It's almost like you could change Bond to anybody else, and or you could just not have him in there, and this story would stand. The only thing that I think makes it interesting in terms of Bond is that he's sort of on his way to a mission that he's quite excited about. And he thinks he's been having to do something really boring. And then he's realized that these people with their normal, boring lives have actually lived quite exciting lives. And maybe he's the one who's lived a weirdly boring life because he hasn't had the opportunity to sort of feel these emotions to the full.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of, in a sense, it's the central story, isn't it? Because it's about the shifting of perspective, which a lot of them are about. But kind of this one is really kind of that's the kind of the turn of the story, isn't it? At the end, as you say, where the kind of the rather dull woman that he was kind of getting really kind of antsy about being sat next to, when her life story is revealed to him, then there's this kind of Volta, where the whole story is flipped on its head, and his perception of life and his life is kind of presented to us in a completely different way. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's completely anomalous, this story. When you kind of read it, you kind of, oh wow, kind of Bond sitting down and being told a story by his friend over brandy. It's so different in tone, and where Bond again is pushed to the kind of the periphery of the story. But I think as you say, it's as a pretext story. No, therefore, it's not about the narrative so much as about Bond's response to the narrative, which is the really important thing. I think it's actually really central to the collection because it's really kind of about what kind of man Bond thinks he is, and about his interiority, which as you say, is given to us sequentially over the course of the novels and the short stories, where sometimes you kind of think his feelings about how rotten the whole stuff is a bit of an ethical alibi because it allows him to do this stuff and anyway, but then feel rotten about it. But here it seems to be slightly different because it's not posited against a mission story. He kind of it allows the kind of the real. It's not just boredom and ennui here, is it? It's the kind of moral vacuum that he lives in, really, to become apparent to him. And so it's quite a daring story, really. I think it's a really kind of daring story for Fleming to have, kind of as a Bond story, because in a sense it refuses everything that one might expect a Bond story to do. There's no mission in it. There's no adventure in it. There's no, the woman that's kind of in it. It's her story, which is really, really important. And what happens to her. And so kind of it's almost as well as an experiment in what kind of story could a Bond story be. I think for a prototypical reader of Bond, it's a kind of challenge, isn't it? It's kind of how do you pass this kind of story as a Bond story? What does it say?
And the actual sort of theme of the story is about cruelty between the sexes, and a sort of war of the roses style war of attrition between a husband and wife, and how your sympathy passes from one to the other and back again, which again would sort of mitigate against an idea of Fleming as just being a purely and simplistically misogynistic writer, because I don't think he is. I don't think he is in the way that's that isn't complicated. Let's put it that way.
No, and this is kind of evidence, isn't it? In a way, if you want to not rebut the charges, but to say that there is something more interesting going on than that, then this is something you can put in front of a reader and say, well, why have this story in the Bond canon? Why have this unless there is something else going on about, as you say, about. In a sense, it's not this. I mean, I found quite this and Hildebrand Rarity had quite a few echoes in this kind of central female character. This young woman who finds herself in bad romantic choices, finds herself in a relationship with in this story, the Quantum Solace, where she, the playboy type that she kind of gets involved with, and then kind of the corrosiveness of that becomes apparent to Bond. She becomes being a pasteboard dolly bird in Hildebrand Rarity, or here just a kind of boring middle-aged woman who's sitting next to him, formerly pretty, as he kind of would be under his eyes. The humanity that's there. That they're revealed to him as real people. Whereas I think kind of, in lots of the Bond stories, I suppose the non-playing characters, they're kind of, they're neither here nor there, and that's why it's an interesting gambit in these stories, isn't it? Is to bring these people into relief as people and as women as well as people. Kind of that they have put themselves in positions because of a misogynistic and patriarchal world, really.
And I wonder, to speak to that, if the two male characters, both the playboy and the sort of romantic husband who's willing to do everything for his wife and then turns into a bigger monster than anybody else, if those two images are actually reflections of Bond's own sort of dichotomy when it comes to approaching women, the sort of playboy with
Yes.
a lover in every port, but also the puppy love romantic who wants to be the Sir Galahad who slays the dragon. No, that's Saint George, isn't it? But anyway, you know what I mean.
So Galahad and the Dragon. What's that one? Yeah, no, I think you're right. But also, kind of what happens to the husband in Quantum of Solace as well. As you say, this hardening, this kind of monstrosity. Because that's the reverse polarity of the romanticized, the self-romanticizing kind of hero, isn't it? That Bond, kind of is more than capable of. Well, he's a murderer. He's taken loads and loads and loads of people's lives. There is something monstrous about Bond in terms of his ethics. There's something not quite human, certainly not humane a lot of the time. And so I think you're right. You could see kind of both this story and Hildebrand as kind of they're kind of galleries of other versions, aren't they? In a sense, Milton Crest is the same, isn't he? He's a kind of horror version of Bond in a way. Rich, powerful, but vulgar and violent,
Yeah, it's kind of about excess, isn't it? It's like Bond has a license, and to some degree that gives him certain limitations, which is makes, For Your Eyes Only so disturbing because those limitations have been suspended for temporarily. And both in Quantum of Solace and Hildebrand Rarity, the excessive when he leaves her the car, he's already been really cruel. So the fact that he's also run up all the debts on everything, so that when she takes the car back, it can't be, you know, she, she's he's fooled her into thinking he's giving her a way out and he hasn't. That's so excessive that becomes real cruel. She's already been cruel, but this is real genuine sadism and evil. And
Yeah.
the same with the Hildebrand Rarity, where the main guy, I forget his name now, you just said it.
Milton Crest.
Milton Crest. I mean, first of all, he's the ugliest of ugly Americans. But also, you're right. He shares with Bond some fascinations of going underwater and all this sort of stuff. But the way he kills things is poison, and the way he does things is, Bond might considers the idea of the whip at the very beginning of the Barracuda's tale, but he actually has one, and it's almost like Bond has conjured it up by thinking about it. It's a really interesting. Where's that how often do you think about something and find it on somebody's wall, the very next day? So there's an element that, yeah, he is the ghost of Bond's cruelty, and it's this massively excessive cruelty, and ultimately he dies again. And I bring back something you said earlier, this sort of slightly gothic story of like it's almost like a Poe that this guy's gonna die in a suitably theatrical manner. And Bond's role, similar to Fiora's only, is just facilitating the woman doing the killing. It's just giving covering fire to the woman's revenge.
I mean, I think I thought that was a fascinating story, actually, kind of Hildebrand. It's kind of there are echoes a lot. There's an echo, quite a very, very, I think, deliberate echo later of Octopussy. Echoes back because it uses very precise language to do with Bond looking at the underwater reef and seeing them as people. And we have precisely the same language in Octopussy at the beginning of that story, where that's seen as a drooling fantasy, whereas Bond, for in Hildebrand Rarity, it's a kind of moment of humanity where he kind of feels some kind of empathy for these poor creatures which are going to be poisoned by Crest. But that kind of enigmatic quality of the ending, where where he's not quite sure whether it's Fidele or her that's done the murder. There's there's a kind of a third one which I thought, which is that he doesn't tell us that he's done it. That kind of because he sleeps on the deck and kind of but really they're both innocent. And he's done some fugue thing where he's half asleep or he decides right I'm going to go under, but we're not told. But it's Bond who goes and stuffs it down the Rarity down kind of Crest's throat again. So the whole thing kind of ends in a kind of suspension. It's not exactly turning the screw, but there's a kind of there's a very interesting kind of unwillingness to resolve that particular story, which I thought again was quite unusual, and technically kind of resisting what I think kind of readers might expect from a Bond story, which is the defeat of the villain and some kind of restoration of order or whatever. Here it isn't that. Kind of they end up in port and Fidel says, "Oh, don't worry about it. Kind of all of these people are my mates or my family." And there isn't a kind of justice served or answers given in that kind of way. So I thought that was a really unusual story in lots of ways.
Yeah, there's this great ending where I think it's also there is also a slight suggestion that Liz not only killed him, but perhaps arranged things so that she would have cover for killing him. So it says, and I'll quote the last few lines. They've arrived in the port. But the beautiful, candid eyes did not flicker. She looked up into Fidelic Barbie's face and said easily, charmingly, "That won't be a problem. I've decided to give it to the British Museum." This is the Hildebrand Rarity. So she's actually going to give them this sort of murder weapon. James Bond noticed that the sweat dew had now gathered at her temples, but after all, it was a desperately hot evening. The thud of the engine stopped and the anchor chain roared down into the quiet bay. So there's this idea of like, hang
Exactly.
on a minute, have you,
Yeah, yeah.
but it was hot, maybe she was sweating because it was hot, or maybe she was sweating because she had something on her mind, and this final thing
Yeah, no,
is
exactly.
is a joke. It's almost like a Roald Dahl, feeding the leg of lamb to the police inspector,
Yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but again, as you say, it's kind of gothic. There's a kind of grotesquerie or excess about it, kind of because I was thinking actually just before we started to speak today about how in a sense how closed the kind of universe is for Bond in most of his incarnations. It doesn't really intersect with other genres particularly. Kind of so Bond and the Gothic or Bond and horror or kind of we do have Bond and detection a little bit, but kind of and
Abbott and Costello and Bond.
Costello meets James Bond. No, absolutely, yeah, yeah. But kind of you know what I mean. Kind of short stories can particularly be ways in which experiments can be taken, can take place with Bond. And when I was kind of elsewhere, there are. I suppose this is down to the estate, but there are very very few licensed Bond stories, aren't there? There's these ones that Fleming wrote, and then Benson wrote a few, two or three, and there's hardly any. And usually you find kind of to do with a kind of an iconic kind of character like Bond, experiments, licensed experiments with that character that he's put in different positions in order to cross-fertilize, to hybridize with other genres. And it doesn't seem to happen with Bond very much, And so the Hildebrand Rarity is an interesting one.
I'm going to counter that a little bit, Brian, because I think that's happening more recently in terms of the estate. You've got the Young Bond series with Charlie Higson.
Yes.
And you've had these literary Bonds, which I think came out round about the centenary of, I don't know if it was Fleming's
Devil May Care and so on.
Yeah, exactly. William Boyd and Sebastian Fawkes did a Bond. So all of these are under license. And I think I can see this increasingly happening. Anthony Horowitz is another one who's written a couple of the novels. In fact, one of them I picked up recently was really interesting because it's a direct sequel to The Man with the Golden Gun. So you can see how someone like Anthony Horowitz might be given the keys to the kingdom and said, okay, you can have these, but you have to do these 5 books that continue, so readers can read what's Bond going to be like, historical Bond in the 70s, and how will he deal with different political things, which I think could be very interesting. The other
But
thing
they're novels, aren't they?
yes, they are novels,
Whereas
yeah.
where the short story form seems to be kind of really underdeveloped for Bond. There's
Oh,
only
I
these
see
two
what you mean.
collections.
Yes, yes. No, you're right. An anthology of sort of like, I don't know, H.P. Lovecraft has had several large anthologies of horror writers just having a stab at the Cthulhu mythos, from Ramsey Campbell and Neil
Absolutely.
Gaiman.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
no,
Yeah,
that,
yeah. I mean, you'd think the estate might be kind of more, might be kind of willing to experiment, I mean, particularly in a kind of hiatus period like we're in now with this, with the kind of the movies.
mm,
It would have been interesting for for them to commission, say, a collection of historical bonds.
mm,
Bond in war, or Bond in science fiction. Kind of which he does border onto in some of the films anyway. So but so it just seems to be kind of a bit of a lost opportunity, because the short story form is a way in which you can have these experiments which don't mess about with the canon particularly. You can even posit them as kind of alternative bonds. But it just seems to be that kind of that hasn't been exploited in the way that I thought it would be. I thought when I started looking at these, I might find this hinterland of all these other Bond stories, and there just aren't any really.
that is interesting. I think that is a missed opportunity. I totally agree. I mean, partly because as well, Fleming in the novels does push genre as possible ways of keeping it. I mean, we talked about this a little bit with From Russia with Love being one of the most straight sort of Russia versus um, NATO espionage stories. Whereas, you have Casino Royale is a gambling film, sorry, film book.
Mm.
Live and Let Die is about voodoo and treasure. Diamonds Are Forever is diamond
Mm.
smuggling and the mafia. Doctor No and Moonraker have science fiction elements. Moonraker, obviously, a lot less than the film, but there's still sort of rocket science in both of them. Doctor No has a giant squid, for crying out loud. There are it becomes wilder and wilder as we go. And you can see Fleming sort of being influenced by people like Raymond Chandler and putting in sort of American hoods who talk through the corners of their mouths and things, and putting Bond in that context that is not his comfort zone. He's often sort of being slapped around by mafia people that he's don't you know who I am? um, managing to get the better of them all the same, but only after
Yeah,
after going
yeah,
through fire.
yeah. No, I'm sure you're right that kind of the last 20 years or so there has been a move to allow the novels to explore different kinds of territory. But I just thought, it's like kind of almost the Joker film with Batman. There's once you start opening up of the possibility of a different way of thinking about that whole universe, then it become then creatively it offers opportunity for for people to actually kind of think, oh, actually, there's something beyond the formula. There's something beyond the canon that we can start thinking about in terms of what Bond might mean.
Yeah, yeah.
That's probably to come, isn't it? Really? Yeah.
Yeah, but I do know there's one novel I haven't read it yet, but it's sort of on my list, which is sort of set in the James Bond universe, but doesn't feature James Bond. So I think that's the beginning. Maybe it's a double O section, or um,
So to do Moneypenny, with a couple of Moneypenny stories.
well, there might have been. That sounds familiar. I should know this because the guest who talked about Live and Let Die, um, David, he's all over this. So he was telling me about it.
Right.
So I should you know. But yeah, well, let's talk briefly about the last novel, which is actually we've skipped over, is Risico, which, as you said earlier, does come into the films as sort of the second half of For Your Eyes Only, with Topol as one of the
Yes,
characters.
as Columbo. Yeah.
And there's also, I mean, this very much feels like a rehearsal of On Her Majesty's Secret Service as well, sort of the gangster picking up Bond and sort of going into partnership with him. Bond likes these bandits. He likes being friends with hard men.
Yes.
Cut to Alan Partridge saying, "You're really hard."
When I was kind of writing some notes about it, kind of, so you're absolutely right. Columbo, yeah. What's the character in American Secret Service?
Stavro Draco.
Yes, Daco or Karim in From Russia with Love. I call them anti-villains
Aye.
because they're kind of they're kind of villainous, but they're roguish and they're larger than life, and they have a kind of code which Bond can sympathise with, and so they kind of operate outside, don't they? So all of them are kind of both inside and outside the game in a sense. Really, they understand the game, but they're really operating, kind of as crime, kind of, but almost kind of, kind of Columbo saying, "Oh, I don't smuggle heroin, I don't smuggle opium." They're, he's Don Corleone. That's not for me. But you're right. There's this kind of recurrent figure, isn't there, of the anti-villain, this kind of larger than life, roguish, who Bond has an almost immediate kind of sympathy with. Because in Risico, he kind of says, "Oh, he doesn't know but all of a sudden he's his friend," and it's kind of like this kind of sudden empathy, kind of just like in From Russia with Love, really. That kind of all of a sudden there's this kind of mutual bond of men, as you say, and it's very different to, say, Milton Crest, who is he's the villain, not the anti. He's the kind of the nasty side of that kind of machismo, whereas these are kind of the kind of the positive men who can do business.
Yeah, they're a bit more unleashed than Bond, but not as excessive as Milton Crest.
No.
They
exactly.
have their own code, and they also sublimate some of Bond's not too hidden desire to be dominated by an older man.
That's true. They are all older too, aren't they? Yes, that's absolutely, along with them. Yeah. I was thinking about
another sort of a counterpoint to M, who, as much as Bond likes him, as the series progresses, you get the feeling that he gets irritated by M and his, terrible wine and his, passion for painting lilacs and stuff. His only hobby is painting these flowers, rather unimaginative paintings of flowers that he's Bond looks at with a little bit of a raised eyebrow.
Yeah. What kind of art does Bond like?
Well, he likes
Nothing modern.
He likes the Daily Express. He reads the Daily Express.
Quite.
He likes Eric Ambler novels and Nero Wolfe novels, which are both mentioned in his. He's not very cultured. He occasionally refers to a painter as a point of comparison when it comes to looking at something, the Degas light or something like that. And in terms of music, I mean, food is where most of his culture lies, is in food. Exactly. But even in food, that's completely under. I mean, it's really weird because there's this sense that he's very famous for liking all this wonderful food, but his favorite meal is scrambled eggs, and that's his comfort food. And he's famous for sort of this thing about being very finicky about his dress, but he always wears the same thing. He's always wearing blue worsted suits and a knitted tie, Or if he's relaxing, it's sort of canvas, canvas trousers and a sort of casual shirt. And he's not exactly adventurous when it comes to those things, despite.
No, he's middlebrow, isn't he? Actually, a lot of his takes is strictly middlebrow. He's a Daily Express reader. In fact, he could probably read a Bond story in the Daily Express, couldn't he? So kind of when it's serialized, he's precisely the reader that Fleming kind of Bond is his ideal own reader. There's this funny thing, isn't there, in Risico actually, where he's lured to the beach and he has to leg it from these gunmen, and his wool suit is not his friend.
It's sweating. It's like a pig.
He's sweating.
Absolutely.
And then he turns up again, and Columbo's there with his men, and they're all wearing tiny shorts.
That's a
With
lovely
their spear guns.
surreal.
It's hilarious.
Such a surreal moment. That could be right out of the later 60s. That could be out of a Monkeys movie,
Yeah,
a
absolutely. Yeah,
Monkeys
yeah.
parody
So
of
there he is.
James Bond.
Yeah, yeah. So he's got sweat dripping out of his socks with his been kind of pelting along the beach for a mile in 30-degree heat, and there are these kind of oiled up, kind of rather large men in their teeny weeny speedos. Yeah, yeah. It was kind of
Well,
bizarre.
one of them accidentally gets blown up by a mine.
He does.
Just like, which is
Yeah. Oh, I didn't
remarkable.
mean it. I was like,
Yeah,
I didn't go through the minefield. Yeah. Fountain of flesh.
a guy standing there frozen as he's realized he's wandered into a minefield.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The poor Marco, he's telling his wife as it rains down on them. But no, but I think this it's the most interesting story to do with masculinity, I think, isn't it? Because well, that and Hildebrand, because of that kind of Bond's need for a certain kind of homosociality, but also his sense of competition and distance from certain kinds of masculinity as well. I was just gonna say to about Quantum of Solace that's one of the few times when you kind of think of him as a kind of as a clubbable person, a clubbable man who would sit around drinking, brandy, telling stories. He's not that kind of person, is he? He's not that kind of man. He finds his kind of masculinity reflected in these slightly more excessive, blown up kind of roguish figures who he kind of identifies with but isn't, and they're often older, and they're therefore kind of provide a kind of authority or authorizing, perhaps.
And they're often non-British as well.
And non-British, yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Whereas in terms of Milton Crest, he's too close. He's the ugly American, but he's very clearly from a similar cultural, strand as Bond, and so that I think kind of hit Bond's revulsion from when the poison is poured into the reef is a kind of revulsion from himself, isn't it? Because he's part of the same culture, really. It's no coincidence that Bond, kind of increasingly, as you say, is kind of goes to America, doesn't it? Kind of as the kind of the series goes on, and the US looms much larger in the stories than it does at the beginning. So I think that you kind of I think you're absolutely right.
Don't know, because like the first few novels, Live and Let Die, the second novel takes place half in,
That's true.
and then Diamonds Are Forever is Las Vegas.
Yeah. I suppose I was thinking. I suppose I think about Living It Die as a Caribbean novel, really. I suppose, like kind of like some of the others.
Yeah, but I mean, it's significant. The significant New York and Harlem is significant.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, but I think kind of the point stands that kind of that Crest is someone whose proximation to Bond is much closer, and therefore needs to be disavowed in a way that kind of these much more they're kind of almost kind of they're all kind of Latin, aren't they? In a kind of caricature sense, in the sense that they're bigger than life, and they all kind of like drink loads of booze and smoke and eat pistachios or whatever it might be. There's some kind of fullness about them. Whereas kind of someone like Crest is a kind of harsh, kind of empty version of a kind of violent masculinity without the kind of life or spirit that you find in these other men. Yeah, well, that's a great word, isn't it? Because that kind of connects with the gustatory, kind of the kind of the Bond and Bond's self-identification as a kind of connoisseur of food. I think the gusto is a great word. Yeah.
So, what have we learned from these stories? What's our takeaway? I mean, I think what we've already discussed. It feels like we come away from 1960, the year you can go and see some Elvis has come back from. We're heading into this, not quite this, and James Bond is a sort of, well, at the peak of his cultural power. Is has not quite reached that to come out, but Fleming maybe is at the peak of his literary powers.
Yeah, so I found it interesting that kind of in this period he moves towards his connection with Playboy, Fleming, and so the stories are kind of several of them are published or serialized in them, and I think he serialized a couple of novels in Playboy as well, doesn't he? A little bit later, so that kind of connection with the Daily Express is kind of troubled, isn't it, around this time, which is kind of what was the kind of key relationship before. I was reading really interesting. I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the book now. It was about Playboy and Bond, and Fleming's relationship to Playboy as this kind of, I suppose, kind of because Playboy were following Esquire at the time and trying to employ just writers. So it's the kind of come for the picture, stay for the writing type kind of idea. Whereas, I suppose, kind of people like Norman Mailer and kind of others were kind of writing for Esquire. And so I think kind of Fleming for Playboy was a really useful legitimate because, but all he does this, it can be presented as a kind of bachelor consumer jet set, very much of what kind of Playboy called at the time the upbeat generation rather than the beat generation. Apparently, kind of Playboy originally started publishing Kerouac and other beats until they got a bit tired of the fact that they were anti-American and more Buddhists, and they realised that their ethos didn't necessarily fit into the Playboy brand very well. So I think these stories, I think, fit really interestingly as this idea of the turn of the 60s, that we have a kind of, as we saw in Marianne Russell, there's a kind of a world to come really here that kind of, and Bond's place in it isn't as certain, kind of that he's, I'm thinking that in the later short story collection, he's increasingly marginal really, and he's at the margins of the stories as well. The world is kind of moving, and as you say, the kind of the novels in the 60s become bigger in their fantastical plots, because perhaps there's a kind of compensatory thing with regard to Britain's actual decline in, decolonized Cold War role in the world. Whereas this Bond is it's a transitional Bond, I think, isn't it? This kind of short stories, they allow a different kind of Bond to come through.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And I think there's a sense as well that in three of these stories, the women sort of go away, moving away. You feel that Judy is off on her own. She's revenged her parents' death, but it also means she's cut with that generation. Marianne Russell, she's gonna have her career in France, a career woman. She might have a fling with Bond, she might not, but seems fully equipped to live her life. And finally, in the Hildebrand Rarity, she's killed her husband. She's now a very rich woman. And even in Quantum of Solace, she's overcome a great, cruelty, and she's actually managed to win back her reputation. It's not no easy feat at epoch. So no, there is a sense of the world is moving past Bond, and Bond perhaps having develop or catch up, or he's no longer in the avant-garde. And plus, other people are traveling now. He's no longer the only person who, let's face it, is just across the English Channel in northern France. It's not in Casino Royale.
Yeah, I know everyone gets to go to the Seychelles, but no, I think that's right, isn't it? Kind of at the beginning of the opening out of jet travel as a mass popular mode of transportation rather than one for the elite. The kind of the exoticism, the kind of the Orientalism that you kind of get in Bond a lot, that itself starts to lose some of its traction, doesn't it? I think. But also kind of the ennui that you find, kicking his heels up as a beach bum on the Seychelles just isn't doing it for him, is it? In Hildebrand Rarity.
Right. He has a couple of days and then he's done. Really, he wants to do something else.
Yeah. He's had enough topping up his town. He just wants to. He'd rather go on a yacht with Milton Crest. Oh my God!
Exactly.
That's but what he is.
He's read the last Jack Reacher and he wants to.
Oh my God!
That's who Bond reads. Jack Reacher. I'm telling you, the perfect Bond novel. God, thank God the Fleming estate hasn't given Jack Reacher the keys to the kingdom.
That's it. Yeah. Have you read any of the kind of the what's his name, Benson, those continuity novels?
No, I haven't, but they're on my list. I think what I'm going to do with the future of the series, once I've done all the Fleming books, is maybe pick one of each and do an episode.
A Gardner and a Benson.
Yeah, Gardner, Benson, Kingsley Amis's novel.
Oh yes, of course.
If
The
we'll
two
see,
literary ones. Yeah,
yeah, we'll see how reaction is to the series. But that, I think that would be a nice continuation Bleasdale Bond
yeah, absolutely.
if there is call for it. But I'd be kind of interested in dipping my toes into that area rather than that. But I'm not sure if it'd be worth devoting episodes to each individual novel. But because I think to just in terms of numbers, I think it just becomes a bit unwieldy then. And there are more interesting things to talk about.
One of the kind of the things I read about Benson, he only wrote four short stories, I think, with Bond in them. And the last one was rejected by the Fleming estate as being too much of a pastiche of Fleming. And I thought that was really interesting. You know, kind of I think this was kind of in the early 90s, I think, when he was writing. Um, and I just thought that was kind of such a what was it about a story that was kind of by a continuation author would be pastiche in that kind of way? Was it kind of was it much more of a parody? Was it kind of were they kind of was it taking the piss out of the whole thing? You kind of it's where does the kind of the line where's the line drawn for later iterations of Bond and kind of elements of pastiche or parody? Because in a way, if you've got Sebastian Fawkes or William Boyd writing as Ian Fleming, what's that if not pastiche?
Mm,
It's
mm.
very good. Why a short story should have been binned for that reason.
Well, I think we've covered these stories very well, and we've seen a new versions of James Bond through different lenses. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, it's been absolutely my pleasure to talk about it with you, Joe.